This time on Poll Hub, insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. How did we get here? For those who've been watching the partisan divide grow ever deeper and wider over the past decade, the answer may be pretty simple. We're looking at the patterns that have emerged among Democrats, Republicans, and Trump supporters, not the same thing, to help explain. Then what would have been the biggest political and polling story in a normal week? Democrats pulling up a stunning doubleheader upset to gain control of the Senate. It's almost forgotten, but we have not forgotten it. We're going to talk about it. And a story we've been following for more than a year because it's near and dear to pollsters' hearts everywhere. The biggest poll of them all, the U.S. Census, missed a huge and important deadline for the first time in its history. We'll talk about that. Glad we had a couple of weeks off because there's a lot to talk about. So let's get to it. And hi, everybody, and Happy New Year. This is Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Maringoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion.
We have a couple of times on this podcast started and been somewhat speechless as to what we would say about events that have transpired. But this one, surely, in the 3 years that we've been recording this, takes the cake. A somewhat armed insurrection at the U.S. Capitol took place 24 hours before we recorded this. And it is hard to digest, as you've seen in any of the media that you've been watching, whether it's some of the conservative media or the mainstream media. There is pretty much uniform condemnation of what happened and a recognition that it is so far outside of any expectation of what has happened in American democracy in 200 and some odd years that we are, as I mentioned, kind of left speechless. Before we get to kind of trying to understand how we got here, I know that we have things we want to say about it. So let me stop there and Lee.
Well, I found this, as someone who many, many years ago worked in the Capitol as an intern when I was in college. And every time I've been to Washington since, I, always liked looking at that dome. And so I was, very shaken by what I was watching. I think I would have been anyway, but I think that this was just a very, very rough scene. And I think that even when the dust has settled, there's a lot of concerns that I have. And, I can't believe that the people who did this inside the Capitol not only were not arrested, but their names weren't even taken down. Now we have to go find them again. I find that hard to believe. And I just think, the President of the United States having incited this is something that's so beyond the pale that it's just hard to even digest. So that's where I was on it. Barb?
Yeah, and I think that the images, there's no question that the images were incredibly powerful. And also anyone who has visited the Capitol or has taken the American pilgrimage to Washington, D.C., when you go to what are these monuments, now the Capitol Hill is a little bit different because people actually work there, but we do all consider it to be a monument and a representation of who we are and what we are as a country. So there's no question that those were incredibly powerful images to see Americans storming and climbing the facade, breaking windows, being very disrespectful, because I know that as I have walked those halls, and there are many places where we were seeing the Trump supporters who had stormed the Capitol. We saw them in places that the public is not invited to view. But as I have walked those public places, I have always been struck by the history of it, just the enormity of what has been accomplished in the name of democracy and what it represents. So for me, it was disturbing to see the lack of respect of something that I hold dear as a symbol of what this country is.
I'll just
that's
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, please go ahead, Jane.
I would just say that the last time I felt this disconcerted was on 9/11, and I was at the World Trade Center. And this was the first time I felt that disoriented yesterday in the afternoon of the day of this since 9/11, and very disorienting. There's already polling about this. We're hesitant to talk about polls that are done with some methodologies that aren't exactly rigorous. And this is a case of that. This is a YouGov poll, and it's not the methodology we use, but I do think it's instructive to talk about some of what they found in a flash kind of poll that they did, especially something that we've talked about in virtually every episode of BOLA for the last 3 years, which is the partisan divide. And when people were asked, do you blame Donald Trump for the actions of those who stormed the Capitol building, or do you blame others? And they were offered congressional Republicans or Joe Biden. 35% of Republicans said Joe Biden held most of the blame. Only 13% of Republicans thought Donald Trump held a great deal of the blame. And registered voters on the whole, 55% thought that it was Donald Trump, and only 17% thought it was Joe Biden. We've talked about this partisan divide when it comes to health and COVID and everything, food people eat, whatever. This one is this. I just don't understand it. I just don't understand it.
Well, the challenge, I was going to say that the challenge for the nation right now, and I think Joe Biden, in talking about his appointment to the Attorney General and other things, is this our political system, or is this Donald Trump's backyard? And if it's Donald Trump's backyard, then you can sort of overlook everything if you think of that. But if you think of this as our democracy and that is the people's house, and forget about all the potential destruction that could have even been worse than what it was, given that no one knew whether these people had weapons with them and what they were really planning to do. A lot of them did. So, I mean, there are a lot of bullet holes in the Capitol. So anyways, that's where I wanted to go with it. But Barb, you were going to say something.
Well, I just think that it is, I think it's instructive, and certainly as pollsters, when we have events like this, I think the first thing, we almost think to do is to go to the polls, and see, see how the public is digesting it, to look at public opinion and kind of step beyond um, just the pundits, and some of the opinion makers. And Jay, you make a really significant point in that this is so much about the polarization, and really the two worldviews that we have in this country, and this event was no exception. I think that there was less polarization on this particular event. There was more consensus. But if we look at political party, you know, that even that goes away. We saw that 62% in this YouGov poll that you mentioned saw that the actions by the Trump supporters at the U.S. Capitol were, and described it as a threat to democracy. However, 93% of Democrats saw it that way, 55% of independents, and only 27% of Republicans. And I can cite question after question, whether it's about Trump's role, whether it's about whether there was fraud in the election. It's that we have two completely different worldviews, two different realities, and I think that there are a lot of reasons for this. We have done a lot of polling, and others have done a good amount of polling discussing some of the decline in trust in institutions that we have seen over time. But one of the biggest, I think, impacts is the lack of trust in the media, in the people who tell the stories, and how we have all just kind of ended up in our silos of information, which really, I think, play a big role in why people have these very, very different perspectives as to what happens, and how they feel on all of these issues.
Yeah, I had two other points I wanted to make here, and I think that your last one really leads into it. One of the reactions I have is, obviously, in the realm of public opinion, there are many Trump supporters who are mistaken in their view based on all the evidence as to who won the election. Now, one of the reasons they think that is because the White House and President Trump has not conceded, despite the 60 court cases in Congress and every recount and all that stuff. So people have been told about this. So the question to me is, how much of this do I put on the people following and misleading leader, or how much do I put on Trump for having led these people astray? And I think that that's one distinction I make. And the other thing I wanted is that thankfully this Congress reconvened. I thought that was a big deal to symbolically move on after that. But the question was, to me, the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans acted very differently to this. The House Republicans continued as if pretty much nothing had happened. They went and they still, went with their decertification and their objections. In the Senate, which had planned to run a whole series of objections and have 2-hour discussions each time, really toned it down. And with the exception of Senator Hawley from Missouri, I thought that they really followed now in the result of this event. They did follow the dictates of Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer from the Democrat side, obviously. So, I mean, I thought those were a couple things. I mean, I'm having trouble figuring out how much of this is Trump, how much of it is his followers, and then also Congress. And, these are what Joe Biden's going to have to deal with. And some of these people are just not going to be negotiable at all. And some of them.
But I think, Lee, there's a bigger issue here about what is actually fact and what is not. And I think in order for us to move forward as a nation, we have to have some basis as to what we all believe, whether it's about, whether it's about the character and foundation of our country, or it's, whether we believe in the institutions that this country is built upon. You have 45% of Republicans in this YouGov poll who either strongly or somewhat support what the Trump supporters did at the Capitol. That's not insignificant. It was the plurality of Republicans, in this country who feel that way. So when you're pointing to Republicans in the House of Representatives, I don't think it's terribly surprising that there is that fit, that match. I mean, I think it is a very different perspective, and I think that there is a very significant problem, and not just a threat to our politics, but as we've seen through the pandemic, I think there's also a threat to our health and just how we organize ourselves and relate to one another on a daily basis. So there needs to be some kind of a consensus that develops, where we at least begin to agree on the same facts, and whether it's about the results of an election, or it's the seriousness of a pandemic, or the implications for closing an economy. I think there needs to be leadership. And I think there needs to be a sense of how people deal with each other, in their own neighborhoods. I think we've become a great deal more segregated, and in a number of ways, and including how we think on particular issues. So I guess we all need to get out of our silos, I'm not sure. I mean, Joe Biden certainly has his work cut out for him, but it doesn't seem like this is going to be something that is solved, in the next week or two.
There's one other thing that a friend of the podcast, friend of Poll Hub, Amy Walter, tweeted out a series of tweets earlier today, and we're recording this on Thursday, which I thought was interesting. And it is slightly political and political perspective, but I think it's worth talking about. And that is the difference between Trump supporters and the GOP, Republicans. And she points out that in the NBC Wall Street Journal polls that have been asking for since January of 2019, but in the final one, they asked, do you more identify as Trump or as a supporter of the GOP? And 54% of those Republicans identified with Trump, and just 38% identified themselves as supporters of the GOP. And it strikes me that that is very instructive as to how we got to where we have gotten, where an insurrection happens among Trump supporters. Are they Republicans? Are they mainstream Republicans who storm the Capitol? Highly unlikely. But what they are is a party of a person, where they replace the US flag with a Trump flag. I mean, I don't remember campaigns where the name of the candidate was on flags that waved from, from flagpoles. That seems new, just in the last 4 years. But this cult of personality has kind of replaced a party, one of our two parties. And I'm just curious, as a student of history, Lee, for instance, is this the point where the nation was at when the Whigs disintegrated, and a second different party, the Republicans, came up? Or is this just a reformatting of the party, much like what happened in the 1890s when the Silverists eventually became Democrats, or were rolled into Democrats?
I think that's the big question right now. And obviously, I don't have personal recollection of those two events, despite my being a student of history. But I think one of the things that we saw this playing out with was in the other big story, the Georgia Senate races, where we had a situation where this was the first time Donald Trump wasn't on the ballot. And this is, gets to the question, were the Republicans running with Trump, or were they now trying to distance themselves? It's the issue that they're going to have to deal with. But Barb, what was your take on what happened down in Georgia?
Well, certainly, I was very surprised, despite the fact that I think the polls gave us a very good and clear picture of what to expect in Georgia. The fact that the contests were incredibly close. I mean, Georgia is a state that has changed, particularly over the last decade. It is still a majority white state, but it has a very large proportion of people of color. And so when we looked at the polls, the pre-election polls going into Georgia, they certainly characterized a very close race. My expectation, and I know, Lee, you had us all fill out our guesses, and I thought that the Republicans were going to be able to hold on to both seats. I think many folks thought it might be 1-1, but I think you had guessed that it would go to the Democrats, and that the Democrats would now control the Senate, of course, with the breaking vote being Kamala Harris once she is signed in as vice president. So, certainly this changes the trajectory for the Biden administration. I think that they have a different sense of what they can accomplish and how they are going to approach some of the things, that policy issues that they have on their agenda. What do you guys think? Does this change things dramatically, or only marginally?
Jay, what's your take?
No, go ahead, Lee. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it's a big deal because it changes the committee assignments and who's going to chair committees, what bills get to the floor, which the Democrats have had a lot of trouble doing. If there are any Supreme Court judges, there's a different ball game if you're having a Democratic majority. And I think, in terms of even in the short term, the appointments to the cabinet and others that have to go for a confirmation process, that Joe Biden's in a very different position today than he was right before pre-Georgia. So I think it changed a whole lot of the ball game right now.
So let me throw out kind of what I did just a couple minutes ago with regards to another subject, which is this 2008, in which case 2010 is a wipeout for Democrats because they do an awful lot. And, Barack Obama in between 2008 and 2010 was, pretty incredible how much they got passed. Or is this the case of a change that is permanent, or at least permanent in political terms, over the next 2 years, where Republicans are actually descendant as opposed to ascendant because of what's happened with Trump and the split in the party?
I think it's an identity crisis right now because the Republican Party, when you cited those numbers, is it Trump's party or is it the Republican Party? And that often happens with a strong leader, but the base of the party stays intact. But the base of Donald Trump's party was Donald Trump, and that's what the loyalists.
Right. So who shows up? Who shows up in 2022? I guess I'm not trying to jump ahead because I'm always accusing you guys of jumping ahead. But I think what the Democrats, I mean, Joe Manchin's the most powerful man in Washington right now. The Democratic senator from West Virginia, who is the 50th vote. He is the most conservative Democrat. I don't know any Republicans. We don't know if any Republican senators are going to cross the aisle for any of this stuff. I just wonder, Chuck Schumer has the toughest job in Washington right now. We thought Mitch McConnell and John Boehner had tough jobs. I think Chuck Schumer has the toughest job in Washington.
Well, in 2022, and you know how we love to look down the road, Republicans do have more Senate seats up than Democrats again. So they will be somewhat on the defensive. But I do hearken back to 2008 when, there was talk of the fact that the Republican Party was dead, that they would never win another national election, that the Obama, Democratic Party was now the party of the future. And lo and behold, 2 years later, they're back on the defensive, and it's a very, very different picture. So certainly the Republicans have, an issue with Trump, but recognize that the November election, I think, was very interesting. There was an enormous turnout, both in terms of Democrats, in terms of Republicans, and Republicans may not have been enamored as much with Trump, but they certainly maintained. They made increases and headway in the House, and pulled out a number of Senate races that many people thought that were lost to them. So I think if the Democrats, want to take anything away from what we have seen over the last decade, it may be simply that they have 2 years for their agenda, and then all bets are off.
Yeah. And did Joe Biden win in November, or did Donald Trump lose? Because obviously the House did not follow Joe Biden's momentum. And then Georgia, well, we can't talk about Georgia and end with Georgia without saying Stacey Abrams, because what a job mobilizing so many people who weren't even registered in November to then vote in January. And if that's a message in the future, it certainly talked that, mobilization at the Democratic base is something that we have to look at down the road as the Republican Party tries to solve this identity crisis also. But there was, go ahead.
And I just wanted to mention one other headline, which certainly wasn't as big as the last two this week, but happened just at the end of the year, which is that the Census Bureau missed the end of year deadline to turn in the numbers for allotting congressional seats. And is expected to put out their new counts on February 9th. This is the first time that they have missed that deadline. Certainly, we have seen a number of delays and irregularities in the count. There's still a lot to be done, but because of the change in the deadline, Trump will not be president. Biden will be president, and we will then get to see whether who gets included and who gets excluded in the next census, and how what that all means for redistricting.
Yeah, I think it's a huge thing that just occurred, sort of, because as we've talked about, the census is such a big deal in terms of not only polls who use the data to base the polling on, but also in terms of, who gets counted, who doesn't get counted. And that has a lot to do with people of color, and it has a lot to do with then how many people are in the congressional votes, and then also the electoral college, and what shifts are we going to see? As we've learned, when the country's so closely divided, all this stuff makes a potentially a big difference.
And money. It's all about state and district funding.
Do you guys worry that the census is having to do an awful lot of fixing after the fact? The count was cut short. They did not count as many people. The actual count, we're actually counting people. There's a lot of imputation that is going on, and there always is imputation. But are you concerned that there's more of that going on in this cycle this 10-year cycle than in prior ones? The data may be less accurate because of that?
I think, as we've mentioned before, I think that the folks at Census planned for everything except for a pandemic. They were really pretty much ready to deal with everything. But when you think about the pandemic, that threw everything up in the air. Statistically, I think that there is a way to balance these numbers to make them reflective of the regions and communities that we do have, because it's not an all or nothing. um, you can't really do imputation if you are missing great bulks of data. But I think that there is enough there. It's unfortunate that so many things coalesced in 2020 during this time. Um, but I think that there is a sense that we can have confidence in those numbers to guide us in the future.
And with that, let's wrap up the first episode of Poll Hub of 2021, the year that is supposed to be better than 2020. Let's see how that goes. Right, we're just out of the gate. Poll Hub is a production of Marist College, of Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor. Amelia Morel, Leo Ruiz, and Madeline Jones are our production assistants. And Marcella Bettman is our editor.
Yeah, and we are hoping that maybe 2021 will be a little quieter in the world of politics. We aren't off to a good start, however. So we're sort of January is moving on, and maybe February will be better than it has been. But we do look very often at the Roper Archives at Cornell University. They're actually going to be having a panel shortly. I will provide that information next week in terms of surveys and archival data. But we rely on them, and a lot of people who are in the art industry do as well as students for going back in time and looking at data.
And certainly, if you have any questions or comments, please reach out to us on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter and Marist Poll on Facebook and Instagram. We love to hear what you have to say. And certainly, if you have some ideas of what you'd like to hear us talk about, or maybe what you'd like to hear us poll about, comment. Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And finally, if you do like what you hear on Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review on your podcasting app of choice. Positive reviews do help others find us, which would be terrific. And while you're at it, if you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe. Thanks very much for listening. Stay safe. Happy New Year, and see you next time.